This person realized last night that no one will ever love them like you did. What if the most devastating loss a person ever experiences is not losing someone they loved, but losing the only version of themselves that ever felt real? There is a moment that arrives without warning, not dramatically, not loudly. It comes in the silence of an ordinary night, when every distraction has finally gone quiet and there is absolutely nothing left to hide behind. And in that moment, something inside them shifts permanently. Not because they miss your presence, but because they suddenly understand, with a clarity that is almost unbearable, exactly what they destroyed and precisely why they destroyed it. This is not a story about heartbreak in the way you have heard it before. This is something deeper, something that operates beneath the surface of ordinary emotion, in the psychological depths where truth lives and where denial eventually collapses. What you are about to hear will make you understand why certain people run from the greatest love of their lives, why being truly seen is more terrifying than being ignored, and why some realizations, once they arrive, permanently reshape everything. If you have ever loved someone deeply or lost someone who saw you completely, you need to hear every word of this. There are certain moments in life that do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with warning signs or dramatic gestures. They slip in quietly, usually in the middle of an ordinary night when the noise has finally settled and there is nothing left to hide behind. And in that silence, something inside you breaks, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply, irreversibly, like a foundation quietly cracking beneath a structure that still looks perfectly intact from the outside. This is the story of that moment. This is the story of what happens when someone finally understands the true weight of what they lost. Not days after, not weeks after, but in that singular suffocating instant when the truth refuses to stay buried any longer. And what makes this particular kind of loss so devastating is not the absence of a person. It is the absence of yourself. The version of yourself that only ever existed in the presence of someone who saw you without a filter, without judgment, without the need for performance. That is a loss most people never fully recover from. Most relationships operate on a surface level that both people silently agree to maintain. You show the parts of yourself that are presentable. You hide the parts that feel dangerous. You craft a version of yourself that is lovable, manageable, and safe. And you offer that version to the world while keeping everything else locked away in the quieter rooms of your identity. And then occasionally, someone comes along who does not accept the performance. Not because they challenge you aggressively or demand your truth loudly, but because their presence alone makes pretending feel exhausting. Because the way they look at you reaches past the carefully constructed exterior and lands somewhere deeper, somewhere you forgot even existed. They see the insecurity you disguise as confidence. They feel the fear you mask as control. They notice the emptiness behind your distractions and the wounds behind your silence, and they do not run. They do not flinch. They simply stay. And in staying, they offer you something so rare that most people spend their entire lives searching for it without ever finding it. They offer you the experience of being fully known and fully accepted at the same time. This is not a small thing. This is arguably the most profound human experience available to us, because to be known is to be exposed, and to be accepted in that exposure is to be given permission to exist as you actually are, rather than as you feel you must appear to be. That kind of love does not just touch the heart. It restructures the identity. It shows you dimensions of yourself you never had access to alone. And when you lose it, when you push it away out of fear, and then spend months pretending you are fine, the day eventually arrives when you are forced to reckon with exactly what you destroyed. Here's what nobody tells you about sabotaging a deep connection. It rarely feels like sabotage while it is happening. It does not announce itself as destruction. It masquerades as self-protection. It presents itself as reasonable, logical, even necessary. A delayed reply that was not really about being busy. A manufactured argument that was not really about whatever surface topic it appeared to address. A sudden coldness in a moment that deserved warmth. A withdrawal disguised as needing space. These small, quiet acts of retreat felt in the moment like survival, like maintaining control over something that was beginning to feel dangerously out of control. But what was actually happening was far more psychologically complex. The closer the connection grew, the louder the internal chaos became. Every step toward genuine intimacy was simultaneously a step toward self-exposure, and self-exposure, for someone who has spent years building walls, does not feel like love. It feels like threat. It feels like standing in the middle of an open field with no shelter in sight, completely vulnerable to whatever storm is approaching. So the walls went back up. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, methodically, almost unconsciously, because the mind is extraordinarily skilled at protecting itself from the very things it needs most. It tells you that you are being rational when you are actually being terrified. It tells you that you are creating healthy distance when you are actually creating irreversible damage. It tells you that you can always come back later, that the connection will still be there, that people who love you that deeply do not simply disappear, but they do, and they did. This is the realization that hits hardest, usually in the quiet hours of an unremarkable night when sleep refuses to come and the mind has nowhere left to hide. The uncomfortable, undeniable truth that settles into the chest like something heavy and permanent. You were never overwhelmed by them. You were overwhelmed by yourself, by the parts of yourself their presence illuminated, by the unresolved childhood wounds that their tenderness unexpectedly reopened, by the deep-seated belief that you were not enough, that if they truly saw everything, they would eventually leave. So you engineered the leaving yourself. You took control of the only part of the situation you felt capable of controlling, which was the ending. You made yourself the one who walked away so that you would never have to experience the devastation of being the one left behind. But there is a brutal paradox embedded in that logic. In trying to avoid abandonment, you became the one who abandoned. In trying to protect yourself from loss, you created the greatest loss of your life. And now, sitting with that awareness in the silence of a night that feels heavier than most, the irony of it is almost unbearable, because they were not going to leave. They saw your truth, all of it, the beautiful parts and the broken parts. And they stayed anyway. They stayed not because they were blind to your flaws, but because they understood something you did not yet understand about yourself. That your brokenness was not a reason to be left. It was a reason to be loved more carefully. And you could not receive that, not because you did not want it, but because you did not believe you deserved it. For a while, the strategy works. You fill the silence with noise. You fill the emptiness with people. You engage in conversations that require nothing real from you, connections that stay safely on the surface, interactions that are pleasant enough, but never reach any depth worth mentioning. And for a while, the numbness holds. But numbness is not permanent. It is a temporary state, not a destination. And the psyche, no matter how determined the conscious mind is to suppress the truth, will eventually rebel against the suppression. It will choose a random evening, an unremarkable Tuesday, a quiet moment between one distraction and the next, and it will flood the surface with everything that was pushed down. Not gently, not gradually, all at once. And in that moment, every new connection suddenly reveals its inadequacy. Every conversation feels like a photograph of a meal rather than the meal itself. It looks like the real thing but provides no nourishment. Every laugh feels slightly rehearsed. Every moment of supposed closeness feels like a performance you are giving and receiving simultaneously. Two people pretending to connect while remaining fundamentally separate. Because once you have experienced genuine depth, you develop an almost painful sensitivity to its absence. You cannot unknow what real connection feels like. You cannot unfeel the difference between being truly seen and being merely observed. And that sensitivity becomes its own kind of suffering, because it makes everything that is not real feel not just inadequate, but hollow. Here is what most people misunderstand about the deepest form of love. It is not primarily about what it gives you. It is about what it shows you. The right person does not just make you feel wonderful. They make you aware of your patterns, your fears, your unexamined beliefs, your unhealed wounds, your unrealized potential. They hold up a mirror so accurate and so unflinching that you can no longer pretend the reflection is someone else. And that is precisely why it becomes unbearable for people who are not yet ready to face themselves. Because in that mirror you see everything. The ways you self-destruct. The ways you push away what you need most. The ways you confuse fear with intuition and call running away a decision. The ways you have been performing a version of yourself for so long that you have genuinely lost track of where the performance ends And the real person begins. They were not asking you to be perfect. They were simply asking you to be honest. And honesty, for someone whose entire identity is built on carefully managed presentation, is the most terrifying request imaginable. So you labeled them as too much, too emotional, too intense, too demanding. You framed the depth as a problem, the connection as a complication, the love as something that needed to be managed rather than something that needed to be received. And in doing so, you protected yourself from the one thing that might have actually healed you. Regret, in its most common form, is painful, but manageable. The regret of circumstances, of timing, of things that were beyond your control. That kind of regret carries grief, but it also carries innocence. You did not choose the outcome. The outcome simply happened. But the regret that comes from understanding that you chose this, that is a different weight entirely. That sits differently in the body. It does not arrive and depart like ordinary grief. It settles. It becomes part of the interior landscape. It colors every subsequent experience with a quiet but persistent awareness that cannot be switched off. Because now they understand, with a clarity that is both gift and punishment, that it was never inevitable. The loss was not written in advance. It was authored slowly through a series of small decisions driven by fear. Every moment of withdrawal, every manufactured distance, every time they made you feel like too much. Those were choices. Unconscious ones, perhaps, but choices nonetheless. And choices carry consequences that do not simply dissolve with time. The consequence here is permanent. It is the knowledge that they had access to something irreplaceable and relinquished it not because it was wrong for them, but because it was too right. Too aligned with the person they were afraid to become. Too honest for the illusions they were still protecting. Too deep for the shallow version of themselves they had been presenting to the world. What you gave them was not simply love in the conventional sense of the word. Love, in its ordinary form, is something people experience with varying degrees of frequency throughout a lifetime. Relationships begin and end. People move forward. New connections form. But what you created inside them was not replaceable by a new connection. Because what you gave them was not just your love, you gave them access to themselves. You gave them a version of their own identity that they could not access alone. You made them feel, perhaps for the first time, what it was like to exist without performance, without pretense, without the exhausting labor of maintaining a constructed self. And now that version of themselves is inaccessible. It is not gone entirely. It exists somewhere beneath the layers that have been rebuilt since you left. But without you present, without the specific quality of your perception and your acceptance, they cannot find their way back to it. Every future connection will carry the weight of that comparison. Not always consciously, not always visibly, but the subconscious is relentless in its accounting. It measures every new experience against the standard you set, and every measurement comes back with the same result. Not quite, not deep enough, not real enough, not you. And so this is where they stand now. Not destroyed, not broken beyond function, but fundamentally altered, standing at the precise intersection of who they have always been and who they now understand they could have become, if only they had been brave enough to stay. The dismantling has already begun. The old stories they told themselves about why they left, about needing space, about things simply not working out, those stories no longer hold. The truth has replaced them, and the truth is heavier, but it is also in its own painful way more honest than anything they have allowed themselves to feel in a very long time. And perhaps that is the deepest irony of all. Even in your absence, you are still doing what you always did. You are still making them confront themselves. Still breaking through the carefully maintained exterior and reaching the parts that need to be seen. Still offering clarity without asking for permission. Because that is what real love does. It does not stop at the surface. It does not negotiate with defenses. It reaches past every wall and every performance and every constructed identity, and it tells the truth, even when the truth is this. You had something rare, something real, something that most people search for their entire lives without ever finding. And you let it go, not because it was not enough, but because you were not yet enough, not yet evolved enough, not yet healed enough, not yet brave enough, to hold something that precious without breaking it. They did not lose you because the timing was wrong. They did not lose you because of incompatibility or circumstance or any of the comfortable explanations that make loss feel accidental. They lost you because they chose, repeatedly and unconsciously, the safety of their limitations over the terrifying freedom of growth. And now they carry that truth, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently, quietly, in the background of every day, in the silence of every night, in every moment where something should feel complete but does not, in every connection that reaches a certain depth and then mysteriously stops, as though there is an invisible barrier that cannot be crossed, because there is. And they built it, and you were the only one who ever knew how to walk through it. That is not a small thing. That is not something that fades with time or heals with new experiences or disappears beneath enough distraction. That is something permanent, something that reshapes how a person moves through the world, how they experience connection, how they understand themselves. You were not just a chapter in their story. You were the moment their story became honest, and the rest of their life will be measured, in ways they may not always be conscious of, against the standard of that honesty. That is your imprint, and it will last forever.